It's time for another amazing chemistry video with Mr. Stapleton. Proudly sponsored by Farming You a Nice Coffee.
Hi guys, welcome to this video, which is going to be all about electrolytic cells. So I really strongly recommend that you watch the one on electrochemical cells first if you haven't, because I'll go through and explain things like electrolyte, electrodes, GAN-EAP, oil rig, all those sorts of things, which I'll assume that you understand before you come on to this one. All right. So in electrolytic cells, there's a different energy conversion occurring to electrochemical. All right, whereas in electrochemical, we use chemical reactions to produce electricity. Okay, in this time, what we're using electricity, okay, or electrons, which is basically what we're talking about here. So we're using electricity to produce chemical reactions. All right, so it's kind of the opposite of what we were doing in electrochemical cells. And there is a complementary nature between electrolytic and electrochemical cells. And in particular, when you're starting to talk about things like car batteries or what we call secondary cells, okay? Secondary cells are ones that can be recharged. So when they're discharging, they're producing electrons and they're electrochemical cells. But when you recharge them, they're electrolytic cells, okay? And so you're putting electrons in to be able to recreate the chemicals you had initially. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you a very, very basic electrolytic cell and then talk about a couple of things that can impact upon the products you actually get from it. Okay? So the first difference in electrolytic cell is that we actually just have one cell. So whereas in electrochemical we had two half cells, here we've only got one. We've still got an electrolyte in there and we have our two electrodes sitting inside our electrolytic cell. Okay, so we've got our two electrodes in here. Just make that a bit darker, sorry, the pen's starting to run out. Okay, so there's our two electrodes. Okay, so it's very, very similar to what we had before, okay, except that instead of two half cells, just one full cell. Now, if we were looking at it in terms of an electrochemical cell, what you would have had joining them up is a voltmeter, an ammeter, something like that, an external circuit. What we have in an electrolytic cell, however, is a power supply, because we're using electricity to produce a chemical reaction. So what we do is we draw a big line and a small line like that. Now the big line represents the positive and the small line represents the negative, and these are in turn connected to each of the electrodes. Okay, so this is the basis of our electrolytic cell. So you notice there's only one cell, not two half cells. There's a power supply instead of an ammeter or a voltmeter, and there's no salt bridge. All right, we don't need to be able to balance up the gain or loss of charge. Okay, so this is what it looks like. So if you go back and refer it to your GAN-EAP, in a galvanic cell, the anode is negative. In an electrolytic cell, the anode is positive. So in this case here, okay, this one over here, in electrolytic, the anode is the positive one. Okay, so it's a direct swap to what we had last time in our electrochemical cell. So the cathode over here is R negative. However, everything else stays the same. Your vowels go together. So oxidation at the anode. So we're still going to have oxidation here. Okay, and we're still going to have reduction at the cathode. Reduction is still a gain of electrons. Oxidation is still a loss of electrons. So none of that changes. All that changes is the polarity of the electrodes. So the anode is now positive, the cathode is now negative. All right. So what we do is we pass an electric current through these electrodes. Now we will either get a reaction occurring through the electrolyte, or we'll actually get a reaction occurring with the electrode. Okay, so it depends on what we're actually using as to what actually reacts. Okay, now quite often our electrolyte is made up out of water. Okay, so because it's made out of water, all right, there's a couple of possible things we can get from that. So that's the first half equations I'm going to be looking at. Okay, so with water, okay, when you pass an electric current through it, there's two things it can produce. The first one is oxygen gas. Okay, two hydrogen ions and two electrons. Okay. So that, hopefully you can see, is a loss of electrons, because here are electrons over here. It's a loss of electrons. Loss of electrons indicates oxidation. All right, so this is oxidation. Okay, oxidation occurs at the anode. So this is the anode reaction. So if you have a gas being produced at the anode, quite often it's going to be oxygen. Okay, if, however, you're looking at the other side, the cathode, what you've got is these H plus ions. So at the cathode, what happens is these H plus ions, two of them, they pick up electrons now and they form hydrogen gas. And that's reduction because it's a gain of electrons. Okay, so if you just have a solution of water and you pass electric current through it, you'll produce oxygen and you'll produce hydrogen. And that's kind of the basis of using fuel cells. Okay, so quite often that'll be your products that you get. If you see some effervescence or bubbling at your electrodes, all right, depending upon what your electrolyte and your electrodes are, these will quite commonly be your products. All right. So what I'm going to show you is just a couple of things that will influence what our actual products of a reaction are, just by showing you a couple of different examples. Okay, 3, 2, 1. So the electrolytic cell I'm going to show you first is just a simple electrolytic cell involving some sodium chloride solution. So if we take this to be some sodium chloride, just very dilute, so we've taken a little bit of salt, we've dissolved in the water so that it conducts electricity. Okay, we've got our anode and our cathode here. What we're going to see is bubbling at both of them. Okay, now the reactions I had just here before for the electrolysis of water, what you got to understand is that if this is sodium chloride solution, what it means is that there's probably about 99.99% of it is water. Okay, about 0.01% of it is actually sodium chloride. So that means the majority of what the chemicals are inside it is water. So we're going to get those two reactions occurring that I just said before. So we're going to get over here at the anode, we're going to have bubbles, okay? And that's going to be bubbles of oxygen gas, okay? Using that equation we looked at before where the water splits into the hydrogen ions and the oxygen. Over here at the cathode, we're also going to have bubbles occurring, okay? And these bubbles are going to be hydrogen gas, okay, as the two hydrogen ions pick up the electrons. So that's just straightforward electrolysis of some dilute sodium chloride. However, what happens if we decide to change it from being dilute sodium chloride to saturated sodium chloride? Well, what that means is that a saturated solution is one that can have no more substance dissolved into it. So now what we're doing is we're changing the concentrations. So whereas before we had 99.9% water and 0.01% sodium chloride, we're now changing this around quite significantly. So obviously we've still got a fair amount of water in there, okay? But let's say, for example, we've now got maybe 50% water and 50% sodium chloride, okay? What that's going to do is that's going to change the product we get at one of the electrodes. And the reason for that is we now have a lot of sodium and chlorine in there as well. So it's more than likely that one of those is going to react. Now, sodium is a very, very reactive metal, okay? And very reactive metals don't take part in electrolysis unless it's the molten solution. And I'll talk about that in another video, okay? So we have some chlorine in here, which could undergo a reaction. Okay, and the half equation for chlorine is this one. Okay, chlorine ions, okay, form chlorine gas and two electrons. Now, hopefully you'll be able to work out that that's an oxidation reaction because it's a loss of electrons. Oxidation occurs at the anode. So what we'll quite often see happening here if we've got concentrated sodium chloride, okay, is that instead of oxygen being produced at the anode, we'll get chlorine. Now, chlorine's more reactive than oxygen, which is why it actually forms, okay? Chlorine gas it should be, sorry. All right, but it only happens because we've got a much higher concentration of the chlorine within there. So concentration is really, really important and does impact upon what you actually get from the product of a chemical reaction, okay, when you're doing electrolysis. We still get hydrogen over there because, as I said, the sodium is too reactive. One other thing I'm going to talk about is what we call the nature of the electrodes, okay? So there's actually two types of electrodes that you can use when you're doing electrolysis. One of them is called inert electrodes. All right, so I'll write that up here. All right, inert electrodes means they are unreactive. That means they don't take part in it. So very, very common inert electrodes that we use are carbon electrodes, okay? Graphite electrodes, all right, which is just another form of carbon, okay? And we often use platinum electrodes as well, okay? All of those are unreactive. That means the reaction will only occur with the electrolyte, okay? So if you want the electrolysis to only involve the electrolyte, you use one of these. Otherwise, you can change it over and use an electrode that will actually react. So I'll show you that when we're going through and doing electrolysis of a solution of copper sulfate, or I'll do copper chloride, okay? And that will show you a little bit different, so the difference that the actual electrode makes. All right, so just get rid of these bubbles. So now what we're going to do is we're going to change this over and we're going to make this no, I will make it copper sulfate solution, sorry, just because I want us to focus on the copper, okay? So if we did this with inert electrodes, okay, we'd have two things occurring, all right? What we would have is copper's a very unreactive metal generally, so it's going to want to pick up electrons, okay, that we're putting in, and so we're going to get a reaction occurring where we have copper ions picking up electrons to form solid copper. Okay, so hopefully you can work out that this one, copper ions picking up electrons to form solid copper, all right, is a reduction reaction which will occur at the cathode. So over here we're going to get solid copper deposited on our electrode. So you'll actually see it as a coppery colour, a metal deposited on there. Because we're using copper sulfate with inert electrodes, the only other thing we've got in there is water. We use sulfate because it doesn't react. So the water over at the anode produces oxygen just like it did before. Okay. However, if we now change our electrodes to now be copper instead of inert, so these are actually copper electrodes, both of them, okay, we get a slightly different reaction occurring. We no longer get oxygen occurring or reacting, being produced there, sorry, I should say, at the anode. What we have is the copper electrode here actually being used up. So the copper electrode loses electrons to form solid copper and electrons like this. So over here we're producing copper ions. All right, so they're going into solution, they're getting picked up and plated onto the cathode. So this is really important. This is the principle of electrolytic refining, where we take some impure copper here. So this might be a copper rod that has a lot of other chemicals, other metals in it. We electrolyze it, the copper comes off of the rod into solution and pure copper is plated onto here. So that's how we increase the purity. You can use this similar sort of process for going through and doing electroplating. Electroplating is where you take one metal and you plate it on top of another. So you can do that with electrolysis as well. Okay? But the main thing is what you take out of today are the differences between an electrochemical and an electrolytic cell. Okay? So electrolytic cell involves using electricity to produce a chemical reaction. Okay? It has an anode and cathode. The anode is the positive one, GaN-E. Electrolytic anode positive, okay? Oxidation always occurs at the anode, your vowels go together. You've got one cell, okay? And the concentration of your electrolyte and the type of electrodes you use can have an impact upon your products as well. So as always, I suggest you go back over this, have a bit of a look, okay? Maybe try and see some other examples of electrolytic cells. This has just been a bit of an introduction. Make sure you have a look through the notes as well, where we talk about the different ways we can use electrolytic cells. And as always, if you've got any questions, ask. Thanks, guys.